Hey, Dr. C here. Hope you're having a good day today. I'm going to talk today about fat. Not obesity. No, I have a whole talk on obesity and I get on their case all the time. But this is fat. We need fat. But what is fat? Now, I'm going to have to go into a little bit of organic chemistry, which I will explain. I'll put it into your terms and all, so you can understand a little bit about it. What prompted this whole thing on fat was basically a lot of the stuff that people are buying in the store over the counter. Now, I dealt with multivitamins in the past. Most people don't need them. I also dealt with probiotics. What are the indications for it? Don't just take them willy-nilly. You have to have an indication for them. And now I'm going to talk about actually one of the growing type of things that people are purchasing over the counter, and that is omega-3 fatty acids. So, yeah, omega-3 fatty acids, but there are indications for using them. And when you use something correctly, it's probably good for you. But unfortunately, most people don't understand why they're taking it because they respond to the things that people put out, the manufacturers put out, and they get an artist or they get usually a good-looking personality to promote the thing and put it on TV, put it on radio, whatever. But it's that ridiculous reason that people are purchasing so many over-the-counter products. So that's why I'm talking about fat. So there are many different types of fat. But let's talk about the major types, okay? We'll deal with the major types. You can have saturated fat. Now, what is saturated fat? Generally, that's the hard fat. That's something that you have under your skin, the hard fat. That's the white stuff you see on the meat. That's the stuff in the skin on the chicken and the turkey. That's the fat that I'm talking about. Hard fat. Now, you don't have to get it just in red meat. There's fats in plants. There's fats in everything that we eat, not just animals and plants, but everything that we eat has a certain amount of fat, as well as carbohydrates as well. And so, saturated fat, that's number one, the hard fat. The second type is unsaturated fat. There are two types of unsaturated fat. Monounsaturated, and poly, more than one, polyunsaturated fat. We'll talk a little more about that in a moment. That supposedly is the good fat. The saturated fat is supposedly the bad fat. So, unsaturated fat, that's mostly the oils. Now, the third type, trans fats. That's something that is very unusual out there in the plant and animal field, but it still does exist. There's still trans fats in some foods, for example, in some seeds and all. Certainly in milk products, butter, cheese, all that stuff has some natural trans fat, but most of the trans fat is produced, it's processed. They're adding hydrogen to the mixture, basically, and creating trans fats because that gives a product a longer shelf life. Unfortunately, trans fats are terrible. They raise the bad cholesterol, reduce the good cholesterol. Not a good thing. Not a good thing. So let's go into those types of fats just a little bit more. The saturated fats, basically, if you look at them, if you're an organic chemist, because this is all part of organic chemistry, if you look at the structure of the fats in general now, the saturated fats have no bonds in them. Now, what I mean by a bond is what attracts, say, the carbon elements and the hydrogen elements and the oxygen elements. They attract each other with these bonds, electronic bonds between them. And these fats have long chain carbons. And on one end of the carbon, there's what's called a carboxy or carboxyl, which makes it an acid. A carboxyl is a COO, carbon, 2 oxygens, H, hydrogen. That's on one end, carboxyl. That's what makes it an acid. At the other end, there's a methyl group. Now, these carbon chains can be any length. They can be short chain, medium chain, long chain. So all these different things can be classified by the length of that carbon chain, basically. Now, when you get into this a little bit more, you find out that, say, omega. What the heck is an omega? Well, when you look at that carbon chain, the chemists will call that carboxyl end the alpha end. And the methyl end, the other end, is the omega end. I don't know for what reason they love Greek letters, but they always tend to go straight to Greek letters for some reason. But the alpha end is the acid, the carboxyl end. The methyl end is the omega end. Now, what is an omega-3? Well, the unsaturated fats, those are the oils that I told you about. The unsaturated fats are different from the saturated fats chemically because the unsaturated have a double bond, 2 bonds, instead of the 1 bond, which is what the saturated fats have. Now, where is that double bond? It's towards that methyl end, the omega end. And so if it's an omega-3, the double bond is at that 3rd carbon end. If it's an omega-6, it's at the 6th carbon end. If it's an omega-9, it's at that 9th carbon end. Try to explain things simply for people, and they understand a lot more now about what these things, chemically at least, are. So those are the way we try to define a lot of these different things. Okay. Now, obviously there's other things involved, but those are the major things people need to know. Now, what about fats? What happens when you eat fat? And you have to eat fat. Fat is good for you. It is. But how do we ingest fat? How do you absorb fat when you eat it? That's an interesting thing, how we absorb it. How? Because when you take fat in, when you eat some fat gets mixed first with saliva, goes into the stomach. In that saliva, there's a thing called lipase, which helps to break down some of the fat. When it hits the stomach, that has a lot of lipase in it, and it has stomach acid. That helps to break the food down. The stomach is like a churn, a butter churn, and so it mixes then with the acid and with the lipase. Now, as the food goes into the small intestine, the pancreas now puts some stuff in, and the gallbladder puts bile in. That bile has bile salts in it, bile salts. The pancreas has amylase and lipase in it. Now, first of all, the bile emulsifies the food that you eat, because you're not eating pure fat usually. There's mixture of fat, protein, carbohydrate. So what that bile salt does, it emulsifies that mixture now. Now, what is emulsify? What does that mean? You can't usually mix oil and water, but when you emulsify that, blends them together, and it causes a mixture of something that is generally not mixed or not mixable. That's what the bile salts do. And that separates the oil or the fat from the carbohydrates and proteins. And so, because carbohydrates and proteins are water soluble, but the fat isn't, it's oil. And so you need to get that oil emulsified, and now the lipase, that enzyme, works on that fat so that it will now be ready to be absorbed in the small intestine. Okay, so far so good. Now when it gets to the small intestine, it's still an oil. So you got to get it into what the body considers a water particle. How does it do that? Well, now what happens in that small intestine is that it forms what they call a micelle, M-I-C-E-L-L-E, a micelle, with the fat in the middle and water soluble on the outside of this particle, the micelle particle. Now it can get absorbed because now the body considers it a water soluble thing. So now it gets absorbed. Once it gets into the small intestine wall, however, once it's absorbed, now it's got to get reconverted back into the oil. How does that get transported then? Well, now it forms what they call a chylomicron. Chylomicra. And again, inside it has the cholesterol, it has all of the fat particles and all, and the triglycerides. And on the outside, you still have that water coating of it. Now it's a chylomicron. Now it can go in the bloodstream, go to the liver, go to the fat, go to the muscles and all, where it can be handled. Now, what use is fat? Well, fat can be used for energy, for example. I told you many times that we use glucose for energy. And glucose gets stored in the liver and in the muscle as glycogen. But there's a very limited amount of glycogen. So if you work like heck for about 12 hours or so, you can use up that store of glycogen very quickly. And so where do you get your energy? You get it from the fatty acids. How do you get a fatty acid? A triglyceride. What's a triglyceride? Triglyceride basically are 3 different fatty acids and a molecule of glycerol. 3-glycerol. So 3 fatty acids and a glycerin molecule. So that triglyceride is the important thing. And that's the thing, too, that people were, for a period of time, very interested in triglycerides in your body. Maybe you shouldn't have too much of that. Too much fatty acid, not good maybe. But now we're finding out that the people who have very high triglyceride levels in their blood, when we measure our lipid profile, it gives you the cholesterol, gives you the high and low density lipoproteins, also gives you the triglyceride level as well. Now, triglycerides should never be over 150. I try to keep mine under 100 milligram per deciliter. And that's what you should do too. Try to keep it down low, keep it low. But there are people who genetically have very high triglycerides, 400, 500. There are people who have those high triglycerides. They can't have even a drink of alcohol because the alcohol will then knock it back up again very high. And because of that, they can get pancreatitis very easily. So you've got to be very careful about elevating your triglycerides too high. Now, there are foods and there are medicines out there that are designed to decrease the triglycerides in your bloodstream. Have they been successful in preventing any problems? That's the issue. Now, it's nice to get that level down, but has it done any good? For people with normal triglycerides, it really hasn't. With people with very high triglycerides, yes, it seems to be helpful. Seems to be. So, at any rate, I'm kind of getting off the subject a little bit here. Let's go into what are the important things that fats do for us. In other words, what are the benefits of fat? Well, we have a number of different benefits. First of all, we use it for brain health. Because if you analyze all of the things that are in the brain compared to, say, the liver, compared to different parts of the body, the brain has a large amount of these fats. Now, they may be in there as in forms of a phosphoprotein, for example, but because they're part of the cellular structure of the brain. And it's used for not just in the development of the brain, but also for the maintenance in that cell wall in the brain. People try to relate the fat to whether you are able to maintain your memory, maintain different things in the brain. Not really too successful in all of the studies, but they're still working on that part. So brain health anyway, that's an important thing that fats do. We notice too that people who have rheumatoid arthritis, they need to have a little fat in their diet as well. So we know that as well. People who have dry eyes, they need to have that lipid layer, that fat layer, up against the pupil, against the surface of the eye, so that the tears will just naturally not get too dried out. So you need that lipid layer, and we use the omega-3s for that. We also use it for our skin to keep it nice and soft and moisture-laden and all. So those are all of the good things that fats will do in the body. So we need in our body, we do need to have, if you look at the total amount of fat that we take in every day, we do have to limit it. We can't make a whole 100% fat diet. You can't do that. But we try to limit the total amount of fat that we take in. That includes saturated, unsaturated fats as well. The total should be between 20 to 35% of all of the calories we take in for a day. So if I take in, for example, 2,000 calories in a day, I should take in 20% of those to 30% should be fat, should be fats. And how much should be saturated fat? Well, remember, saturated fats are the bad fats. They're the bad fats. And should be less than 10%. In fact, American Heart Association gets it even further down. 5 to 6% of the total fat should be saturated. That's it. So that makes it mostly unsaturated fats that we should take in. In other words, 60 to 70% of what you take in should be unsaturated fats. We shouldn't take in any trans fats, 0. That's what you're looking for. Fats are great because they can break down. Once I described how it gets finally into the bloodstream, goes to the liver, goes to the muscles. Now, once it gets to the muscle or liver cells, now we can either use it, we can break it down again, because you can get gluconeogenesis. You can produce glucose from those fatty acids. And you can get 9 calories out of each of those, out of each gram of fat. 9 calories, not bad. Much better than glucose, which gives you about 4 calories per gram. So they're very good energy producing. But what if we don't need the energy? Well, then it gets stored. It gets stored around the muscle, gets stored under the skin, stored in body fat, basically. So those are the things that can happen. And then when you do need it, the body will then break down the fat and produce glucose, which gives you the energy. A pretty decent system. And it usually works pretty well. Usually works pretty well. So all of those things are really great. So originally I wanted to talk about the omega-3s and omega-6s that are out there being sold on the market now. They're supposedly great for heart health. Now, are they? Are they? Well, I don't know. There are some of the products that, like Vasipa, for example, that's just a pure omega-3 fatty acid. Very pure omega-3. High dose. They give you 4 grams per day that they expect you to take of that. So that's a lot of fat. But is it useful for heart health? Very conflicting studies. Very conflicting. So we're not ready to say automatically that it's good for heart health. But it is marketed as a heart healthy product. Now, what else? What else is good about omega-3 fatty acids? Well, part of it is due to the 2 elements that are in there. The EPA, which is isocapentanoic acid, but we'll know it as EPA. We see that, the EPA. You find that in fish oil. You find that in krill oil. You find that in a number of different things, but mainly it's fish oils that people use. Or they eat fish. Best way to do it, to eat a fatty fish. And so people will eat salmon. People will eat herring. They will eat all of the different types of fatty fish that are out there. That's the heavy fish. Now, that's the icosapentaenoic. Now, you also, besides that, get the DHA, the docosahexaenoic acid. And that is also found in fish as well. Now, which is better? Well, the EPA supposedly increases the HDL, that's just a good lipoprotein, and decreases the LPL, the low density lipoprotein, LDL, which is the bad cholesterol. It really isn't cholesterol, it's a lipoprotein. But no, those are the terms that we use inadvertently sometimes, but that's what we do. Now, what about, those are the omega-3s. How much do you need a day of omega-3 if you want to take it? Because if you have dry eyes, it works for that. And I told you also that it does benefit the skin. It's used in a lot of skin products as well. And so it does improve people who have rheumatoid arthritis, in other words, joint problems. It does seem to help that. You know, probably not a bad thing, but don't go over 1,000 milligrams, 1 gram a day of the EPA. Now, the DHA, on the other hand, that isn't as effective at doing that. But they do work kind of simultaneously. And so they are pretty good. It is an essential fatty acid, as is omega-6. 3s and 6 are essential. What do I mean by that? Your body doesn't make them themselves. You got to take it in. You got to ingest it. So they're essential fatty acids. Examples of omega-6 fatty acids are linoleic acid and arachidonic acid. Now, we see this mostly in the seeds and oils. We get it mostly with olive oil, flaxseed oil. We get it in seeds, nuts, grains. I use it with olive oil. I don't eat a lot of seeds. I do eat a lot of nuts. Almonds are very good. Cashews are good. So those are all good grains to, good seeds to eat. And the grains are good. Now the omega-9s, on the other hand, those are not essential. We can make that in our body. And basically the ones that are out there are oleic and stearic acid. And we make them ourselves. And they're found usually in olives, avocados, nuts, seeds, and vegetable oil. It's also found in as well. The omega-9s are usually, it helps to balance out all of the things, balance out the cholesterol, and maybe a little positive effect, decreasing the low density, LDL, cholesterol as well. So those are the things that it can do. You can get this stuff naturally, and I always will recommend natural ways of taking in all of these things rather than to take a pill. Now the essential ones you can take in with food. You take it in with food. You can get a little bit of the unsaturated, like I mentioned, with the different oils, the olive oil, corn oil, canola oil. So those are good ways of taking it in. You can also have every week have an oily fish as part of your diet. We use salmon because salmon is the most readily available here in the Northeast, and so I use salmon. It's a good fish, and it does have a very reasonable amount of the unsaturated oil as well. So that's what we do for the unsaturated. Saturated, remember, you have to limit. What are the ones that are really bad for you that people overeat? Hamburger. Now the 80%, that's 20% fat. 20%, not good. Not good. You can get the real lean hamburger. Get the lean one. That's okay. But we also love to have sausage. We love to have bacon. We drink plenty of milk, use butter to cook with. All of those things are not good for you. They have too much saturated fat. Not all the oils are good either. Saturated fat, a lot in coconut oil, palm oil. Be careful of that. There are some things, too, that have a lot of triglycerides in it as well. A lot of the processed foods. So be careful about that. Know what your triglyceride level is so you can limit your alcohol and stay up with things. So those are all different things that I needed to talk to you about. And as usual, you have to be reasonable about what you eat, and always, always have a reason for using something, a medical reason for using something, so you'll know if that product is effective or not. Okay, this is Dr. C. Have a nice day.